Hey, if you're watching this, I just wanted to say thank you and also give you a disclaimer. 13 minutes in, the audio cuts off, but thankfully my friend also recorded some audio, and so I attached that to the video. My voice is a little lower, the mic is farther from me, but you can still hear everything. I would advise to use headphones if you want to watch it. Thank you.
All right, listen, we pushed. Good.
No, we pushed a lot.
Good. Come here, you. That was great. That was awesome. Okay? This is what we do. This is what we do. Right? Because I respect you, I challenged you.
Yeah. I do appreciate it, yeah.
All right, good.
Very good. Okay, go ahead. Now enough of preaching. It's my last class with you, so I got to tell you the Gospel of Alvarez. Go ahead.
All right, thank you guys. And thank you for letting me record this so I can track my growth and everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is basically my analysis on St. Thomas Aquinas' natural law. I kind of call it a defense, but I'm open to like all sorts of criticism. So premise one, so it's basically just an outline of my argument, and then I get to a little summary of what we could call the defects. So 1, the universe contains universal constants that are necessary. 2, the most foundational universal principle is the primary principle of non-contradiction, from which all other principles flow. A thing cannot be and not be at the same time. P&C establishes being. Order flows from P&C, for order is the manner in which things coexist, the way things be without contradiction. Reason naturally flows from order, for rationality is a recognition of order. For when a man asks what is reasonable, he asks, is X according to proper order? Reason is one, for there is also one law of order, which is something St. Thomas Aquinas asserts in the Summa, from which all things that be must follow in order to exist without contradiction. Reason being one is the same in all who have the power to reason. From the principle of order and reason flows the notion of the good. For when man asks, is X good, he asks, is it reasonable? Is X according to proper order and reason? Which again naturally flows from P&C. In other words, we get value from an objective order. What is good is then contingent on order and reason. Order and reason is objective by virtue of P&C, which is necessary. All things within the universe are subject to the principles provided, whom all flow principally from P&C. All following principles then must contain order and reasonability, which is inherently good. It is innate for man to be inclined to reason, for all that he does he naturally reasons within himself. Man has free will. Universally, all men are inclined to reason, but may not act according to reason due to free will. Emotion by nature is not unreasonable, because emotion in its nature does not act but rather is something. Emotion has not its own will, for only things with the capacity for reason will. Emotion is simply another power of the soul like reason. Emotion, like all things, have its proper order. Reason, being that which concerns itself with order, puts the powers of the soul like emotion in order. Emotion, not in order, is the cause of which man acts disorderly, not according to reason. For when man says X acts emotionally, he says irrationally and disorderly. All men are universally inclined to act according to reason, from order, from P&C, which therefore we get the idea of order of behavior. The order in which man ought to behave is what we call the natural law. The natural law's primary principle reflects and flows from the principle of non-contradiction. For it is natural for man to be inclined to seek existence, in other words, to be and remain in being. The primary principle of the natural law is to seek human flourishing, which in effect is to seek to be, to seek to remain. From seek human flourishing follows the principle do the good and avoid evil. What is opposite to the good is opposite to be, for what pertains to the principle of human flourishing pertains to P&C. Reason, being one, instills the objectivity of human behavior, which is to be orderly by virtue of P&C, from which we get moral objectivity, in other words, the natural law. So then, the natural law flows from the eternal law, which is simply defined as God's overarching divine plan for the world, for eternity. Within the eternal law is the design of the necessary and universal principles, the framework of reality. That which is then divine is that which is the essence of God, who moves the world into creation, whom we cannot know by virtue of its existence, but rather by virtue of its creation. In my estimation, it is fair to relate the belief in the existence of never-seen quarks as to the existence of the never-seen God. For man knows God by virtue of his extended hand, his effects, his grace, his design. In like manner, we know quarks by virtue of their effects, though we cannot say that we have analyzed them. This is reasonable faith, which is what Christians hold. This makes certain revelation empirically verifiable, which that's kind of like out of nowhere, but we can get into that later, which is something that the Catholic Church holds, a model for the verification of things like miracles and the canon of the Bible, how we come to declare God's extended hand as such without error. Fundamental to his moral philosophy is the equating of moral order to the order of logic because of one reason. For Aquinas says that which is orderly is justice, from which we get the notion of the good. In other words, that which is always reasonable is always good. It is also important to understand that sin in Catholic understanding is nothingness, the privation of goods, which goods being again existence. For there could be nothing of God's creation that he designed to be not good, by virtue of his innate goodness. The weakest part of St. Thomas Aquinas' arguments are not by virtue of his thought, but rather by virtue of its absence in said text examined. For I am sure if Aquinas were asked now, which I can since he's alive, which is a Catholic joke of intercession, he would fill in those gaps of his argument rationally. For the point of the Summa was not to answer all philosophical questions, but rather to introduce theology to the reader, which he saw as the pinnacle of philosophy in essence, faith and reason. St. Thomas Aquinas was principally a saint, and his aim was to evangelize. Philosophy was just and remains a tool of our cognitive power to seek the truth that is the source of all being, God. Now, the weakest parts, there's 3 parts. Number 1, how is that which is done by God always natural? God does not contradict himself when he seems to override our logic, the primary principles, because everything he does is in congruence to the primary principles. In other words, though reasons unknown to us, there are and they can be known by virtue of God's goodness, which again is reasonable trust, which is my way of equating faith, which is apparent throughout history, which contains revelation. And here's an example that we can talk about after if it comes up, which is a defense of like, how can we come to follow the authority of a God if we don't have the reason in ourselves to follow him at that circumstance, and which we can get into after. 2, is reason truly one? The primary law, P&C, universal and necessary, proves objectivity. Objectivity flows from objectivity. From P&C, we get one order and one reason. Reason is the same in all, though the application of reasons must be properly ordered. For the habit of disorder, original sin, is the capacity of disorder now open as a learned habit, a potential open to all. And 3, here's a typo, I meant to put a 3 here. Can the natural law really change? Ultimately, no. The primary principles are never overridden, for everything God does is for human flourishing, and reasons there are, though some reasons are unknown to us according to circumstance. So the secondary principles are the ones that change because they are a matter of conditions, and those conditions are not known to all, and that's why the conclusions aren't known to all, and those practical reasons. So that's my assessment.
Oh, this is excellent, very good. Stay in the back,
Okay.
back. The objections, I
Right.
assume that you object. I think those objections are very, very good.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, in your commentary on those objections, you seem to be essentially answering the objection.
Yeah.
All right, so you're agreeing with Aquinas.
Yes.
So let's go by the 3 of them, because
Okay.
that's where you're really addressing, and I think you are homing in on the fundamental issues in the Aquinas defense of natural law. One refers to that quote that you brought to bear in this class, right? Where he says, if God says, go and steal, right? It is not only morally right, it is right according to natural law.
Yeah, in some way it's natural to God to do so.
In ways that we don't understand, which of
Right.
course creates a kind of a wedge, right? This continuity, this is George's pet peeve here, between our
Right.
intuitions of morality and God's.
Right.
We have the image of God. The image of God works provided in some cases, but it doesn't work in all cases. Like in the case, our intuitions say that stealing is wrong and committing adultery is wrong, but yet Aquinas admit that if God commanded it, they're only right, it would be according to natural law.
Right.
So, there you go. That's the objection. But you're saying he doesn't contradict himself when he seems to override our logic and our morality.
Uh-huh.
You have added that. But then look what you said, because everything he does is in congruence with primary principles.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, what seems to us like the opposite of human flourishing is the human flourishing. In some way, there is reason that God is doing these things. Okay. So I would say, for example, the example that St. Thomas Aquinas provides, stealing, right? He would say that it's not actually stealing because it belongs to God ultimately, right? So then I would say that sounds valid to me, but how should I follow that command if it doesn't sound valid to me in the first place? And I would say, by virtue of our relationship with God, God has made himself manifest through miracles which are empirically observable. I would say through that trust, that's enough reason, is what I'm saying.
Okay, so essentially, you see, God commands you to steal or even extermination of the Canaanites, right? I think Juan would have to, Juan is about to say. It doesn't look to us, it looks like genocide, but no, God commanded, therefore it is not genocide.
Right.
But isn't that kind of a bridge too far, Oz?
Well,
to say that? I mean, now you created a huge discontinuity
Okay.
between natural law in us
Right.
and natural law in God. Presumably, God is the one who put natural law in us.
Yeah,
Right.
another thing is like just because God commanded doesn't mean that like the punishments that are entailed by the command are morally justified.
So what would you say punishment? So what would you say the
So
punishment is?
kill all the Canaanites,
Right.
right? Like every living thing that breathes.
Okay. Right.
So like just because God has the right to command certain things doesn't entail that the punishments that flow out of that command are morally justified.
Right.
Like there's a difference there.
Reply, because you haven't replied.
That's interesting that you say punishment, because to me, I don't see that as punishment. I just see that as the consequence of their actions. So another thing is like the whole genocidal thing. Like,
But is that morally justified?
I would have to trust in God's goodness that it is morally justified.
That is ultimately your
So in another sense, again, even though I don't have the reasons now, I have to ultimately believe with reasonable faith that God has been good in the past and he will continue to be good, and there will be reasons provided to me later on if God wants to give me those reasons that what he did was good. So like, let's say even in our generation right now, we might not know why God allowed this terrible evil to happen. But then some generations later, because that's the thing, I don't believe in like my death being the end of all. Like, I believe that if God wants to, he'll give me those reasons, and eventually
in heaven will all be clear.
Well, yeah. Not necessary, not as a necessary truth that we have to know those things in the future, but he, by his grace, he can provide those things.
I feel like this is giving too much leeway
Okay.
to God's understanding. And in fact, like it even undermines whether even following a certain commandment might be good, because ultimately God has the best plan ever.
Right.
And so like even like for all I know, God probably wants that guy dead because there's a greater good in store. If that guy is dead, then he's alive.
Right. So then we're getting into the practical reasons. You would have to assess based on the conditions. What reason do you have to think that God is commanding you to say that?
So that's another problem. So the conditions, like
Right.
the secondary principles,
Mhm.
it's like if God is omniscient, that means that God knows what will happen in the future from the outset. He can't
Right.
change his mind about things.
Well, it's not necessarily that I would say he changes his minds about things. It's just the way that
No, because if he's omniscient, that means he knows everything that will happen from the outset. Like
Right.
He will know in advance what will happen after this class.
Right.
And so like he can't change his mind. If that is true about God, then he can't change his mind about things. But the secondary principles does allow him to change his mind about things in the future.
I'm sorry, I'm not following, because I don't see in a way that God can change his mind. Because it's not that I don't see.
Well, like, what do you think omniscience is?
Okay, omniscience is like he knows for a fact that these things will happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're
Right,
restricted of our free will.
fact.
Right.
So that means that from the outset, God knows that there are certain things that will follow as a fact, whatever we think, in the future, and he can't change his mind about that.
Oh, I see what you mean. In a sense,
But
like
the
he knows
facts-
he knows our capacity to understand the circumstances, and if we were to reject his command, he should know better, because we know that we don't have the reason sufficient to follow him.
I'm saying that like if he is omniscient, then that means in the future there are certain facts about the future that will be in place that he will know
Like
about
he puts those
from
things
in advance. In advance.
Wow.
So then that means if he knows about it in advance, he can't change his mind about what will happen in the future. But the secondary principles do allow him to change his mind, because there are conditions of morality that make it more complicated, right? Like there are like empirical aspects of morality that make the deed that what is Aquinas says that like it blurs out the details or something like that, or
Right. The more conditions set, the harder it is to find a conclusion.
yeah. But like for God, why would this be hard at all? Like this is he's omniscient,
Well, I don't
right?
think God's in the hot seat. I think we're in the hot seat. Like we're happy since he says reason is one. I predominantly believe that if we reason enough in the correct order, because I believe in an ontological objective order, that we will
Yeah.
come to the same conclusions. And that's why I think that there's room for like case studies.
So is the secondary principles more of an us thing or of a God thing?
I would say it's more of an us thing. It
Okay.
matters on the conditions that we've set by virtue of our actions.
Okay.
It obfuscates, the secondary principles obfuscate our view from how the evaluation of the moral right or wrong.
Right, because then there's so many other things that we have to put in proper place.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Okay.
So in a sense, the primary principles are like the guideline where we have to direct towards. And then these conditions, we have to see in which proper place we have to put them. So again, with the principle of like, not the principle, but by our nature, like the ability to sin, right? Things like that. These obstruct our ability to reason because actions are habit. So like we've lost that habit of being virtuous and we have to put the things in proper order. So in another sense, that's where I get the idea of generational sin. It's like people become so accustomed to act viciously, and that passes through generations, and that further obstructs our understanding of how to properly put the correct actions in proper order, how to follow that correct direction. That's my assumption.
No, it's good, it's good, no, it's very, very good. Because he does say that our sinful nature and sometimes our willfulness. Oh, yeah, of course.
Wait, keep on going.
Oh, yeah.
Because I want to see, oh, you're recording this. Oh.
It's okay. I can cut it off.
If you guys keep going, because I just wanted to look at
Yeah,
something up here, because I had looked away.
Yeah, there was one that you talked about man has free will, and I was like, oh.
Right. Wait, do you think man has free will?
No, because it's like packing in too much already. Like,
Right. The thing is
like,
that I tried to.
Because then it's like, oh, do you have to, like, because you're already presuming a stance that's
Yeah.
like controversial.
Yeah, that's.
What's the objection to free will? What is your objection to free will?
Well, you know, the typical objection that, like, how can you be sure that you have free will given that, like, the physical laws of the universe influence your actions?
determinism, basically.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, I completely reject determinism because I don't think we're extremely like just material. I don't think that. I think
That was Kant's point, that
right.
he postulated the soul because he wanted to have free will and he wanted to have this, that we're responsible for
Right.
our actions. Otherwise, there is no justice. Your point is, Kant doesn't prove that we have free will. He simply needs it for his understanding of justice.
Yeah.
The question is, maybe Kant is wrong. Maybe there is no justice.
I would
Maybe
say
there is no free will. You know, he needs it
Right.
for morality, but why there is no morality?
I would say that the very fact that our psychology and science says that you should technically remain an alcoholic by probability of the fact that you just have that innate habit. Like now it's basically like it's such a learned habit that it's basically innate. You shouldn't be able to break from this, like according to psychology and science. And I would say that it's the soul, it's the will, and the ability to recognize the fact that this is a bad thing that actually proves that you have free will. The fact that you can break out of these things that would necessarily just be material. Because if according to that psychology, now I'm an alcoholic up here, all I can ever be is an alcoholic.
That's not necessarily
No,
true.
that's-
That wouldn't be the psychological orientation.
Okay.
At least the modern literature of addiction follows that every single form of type of addiction that we see manifest as behavioral
Okay.
is the way of dealing with addiction. The actual addictive principles themselves underneath, or what's happening, is, I mean, it's a mixture between mentalisms. In the language of behavioralism, it's the behavior, and then you have something called mentalisms. It's the combination of mentalisms with neurotransmitter habits, that's to say the synapses that are already pre-fired to be able to go to that specific identification, to be able to handle the specific stressor or whatnot, combined with the behavior itself. So it's like a threefold thing that combines together to lock on it. And what allows somebody to even break addiction in the first place is a displacement of the object that is identified as the solution to the addictive
So you
behavior.
substitute that thing that would have. Okay.
Yes, yes.
So, but then what would you say causes you to make that substitution?
the systems, so I mean the world is variable in the first place, so like if the environment or community facilitates a certain type of object being the object of addictive behavior, the environment's changing, circumstances changing, leading to I'm no longer satisfied but continue drinking. That's to say, like, some people then have again, there's a circumstance where I can drink more, or suddenly I'm realizing because what I'm drinking right now isn't satisfying me. I can drink more, or I can start questioning whether this is the thing that's actually satisfying my addictive drive. Therefore, I start to substitute something else. Other people then go drink more, go to drugs, go to an AA, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or I start to clean up life. You get what I mean? There's a variable options of what the object of satisfaction is in that variable circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another thing is the father and son analogy. Mm-hmm. It works only to only to such extent. The analogy can break apart because father and son interactions are direct. They're not indirect. Whereas father, God and human race interactions are indirect. They're you have to appeal to the Bible, right. You have to appeal to miracles, I guess, and then you have to appeal to your church or something like that.
But you would say it's direct because it's a physical thing, directly speaking.
No, because my father can tell me you should do this, you should do that. He's talking to me, he's communicating to me, and we're doing a back and forth. You can see a difference between how I started with my father and how we're going, right? Well, so when it comes to God, it's indirect, and so the problem there is the analogy works insofar as you explain it with regard to a father taking their son to the dentist, and then the dentist, they're the son doesn't understand, but it's for the greater good. Right. But say there's a father that all of a sudden disappears and doesn't give an explanation why he disappears. And it would be morally good if the father actually explained to the son at least something to explain why he's gone. But yet in this case, the father doesn't do it. Right?
Okay, well, wait. Have you all seen the movie Bull Durham?
No.
Well, there's a scene where...
Say the movie again?
Bull Durham is about baseball.
No,
I gotta tell you this. I felt exactly like Tim Robbins. Mm-hmm. Tim Robbins is this guy, Kevin Costner is very smart, very educated. But Tim Robbins is just this kid who had a great arm, but he calls him meathead. Mm-hmm. So I felt like meathead listening to you three. I'm going, and then there's a line where he's just totally lost, right? Because he's carrying on an incredibly deep conversation with this woman, and he says, "Well, is anybody going to?" I'm sorry. I hope you don't mind. This is a quote from the movie. He says, "Is anybody going to get laid here?" Because they're all talking, right? And he's out of it. So I felt exactly like Tim Robbins, right? I mean, what the hell's going on with you guys? So is there free will or not? That's the question.
Okay. So then
I hope you didn't mind.
Sorry. So then I want to respond to is that those circumstances, they're conditional. So the circumstance I set in my analogy, they're specific for that analogy. So what I'm trying to prove with that analogy is just that there are good reasons that you may just not know about.
Yeah, but it's only restricted to the analogy of those reasons that a child wouldn't know about with their father. It doesn't extend to other aspects of father-child relationships, right?
Well, wait a minute. What your objection is getting to is that you are asking us to trust that somehow the extermination of the Canaanites, and as you put, if you look at the text, it doesn't say kill the bad guys. It kills everything, men, women, children. So now that goes against our intuition that, well, perhaps I could justify that if you kill the bad people. But the command is to kill everybody. There's no discrimination. Now you would have to say that God had reasons why he killed the children and the old people. You see what I'm trying to say? Right. The guilty, whatever guilt they had, with the innocent. Or whether their crime, which by the way, you know what their crime was? Do you all know what the Canaanite crime was? See? You gotta find out.
Worshipping false idols?
Well, goes without saying, but the Israelites themselves also got involved in that too. Is that they were fertility cults. Canaanite religion was based on fertility,
Oh, the
So,
sacrifice of the babies.
No,
It's not
well,
done?
some of them did.
Okay.
The Moabites did, but inside Canaan, the Moabites lived in what is modern day Jordan,
Okay.
Jordan, east of the Jordan River and the Red Sea. He said they had sex. They believed that sexuality is integral to religion. So when you go to their temples and you pay, there were women there who you had paid and had sex with, so that would mean it's called sympathetic magic, that you would bring fertility to your crops.
Yeah.
And the Israelites, the God of Israel, is very much male, but also sex is evil. I mean, relating God to sexuality is evil.
Sex is only sacred within the marriage.
Right,
ceremony.
and yes, and these people carried on like that. And yeah, imagine going to a temple to worship God and you're having sex at the temple. So that was very abominable to the Israelites.
Yeah, but like my point is like.
Is that
for-
enough to
like-
deserve to be
Yeah.
exterminated?
Yeah,
right?
my point is like the analogy is imperfect because like it only serves to like it overlooks the fact that God is not direct. It's not having direct relationships with us like a father and a child would. One. Another thing is it's like God already makes his existence known through the Bible, through arguments. People give arguments about God. People give testimony. People give miracles. And yet the best God can, it doesn't seem like it would take God like it wouldn't, it's not rocket science for God to like explain his reasons, right? And yet he doesn't. So he acts like a father that all of a sudden, like there's some history about him. Maybe the child knows his father through his mom or something like that, but he disappears out of nowhere. And yet the father can explain why he disappeared in some sort of way, but he chooses not to. So then that's where it's like problematic because it's like God can explain his reasons why he gives a certain command and yet he chooses not to. Given the fact that he's already there's argument.
Not because he doesn't want to, it's because we cannot understand them. Because see, your analogy with the Father breaks down. The Father is one of us. He's a finite human being with finite reasons that he can explain those reasons to us. God is an infinite being, and he has reasons that we cannot perhaps penetrate.
But then if God is an infinite being, he would know how to explain things to finite beings.
But
And especially if he's omniscient.
Jesus says in the Gospels, I fight to the disciples, you're not getting it. If you have a hard time understanding the earthly things, how can I expect you to understand the heavenly things? Aquinas could see some that verse to say, there are certain things that God knows and reasons that God has that will be totally, are you ready? It would be like an alien speaking to us who obviously is very smart, has reasons, and able to travel millions of miles light years to get here. And now he cannot explain his mathematics. He cannot explain.
But Professor,
obviously he has reasons.
I took a con class, and that professor was extremely smart, but he knew how to explain Kant to me in a way that I could understand, given my limited understanding. So it's like, why not? Like, you're giving God way too much leeway here. If God has omniscience and he's infinitely knowledgeable, and this, like my professor isn't God, but he had way more knowledge about Kant than I could ever have. But he knew how to explain it to me in a way that made sense.
Well, that works in certain cases, but if you were to jump into the physics department right now and take a course, sit in the course in quantum mechanics or Gödel's theorem in the mathematics department, with your knowledge, you will not be able, no matter how hard he tried to explain it to you, you won't get it. I'm sorry.
But then,
Maybe the superficial element, but not the very profound reasons. It was, you want to believe God can explain everything. Maybe God is so great.
but God can give a supervision. God doesn't have to give a
Well,
profound
what
reason.
God is
He can-
saying, when he's saying to you, here I am in the odd place defending your argument. Let's go, ouch.
You know, it's too much.
Alvarez,
Get one there.
is that God, you got to trust God. That is really your bottom line. You have to trust that God has a reason because his track record is that he's loving, that he's good, and therefore, okay, we gotta trust, right? There's an element, maybe one day his reasons will become clear to us. maybe because of our sinful nature, we're unable to follow his reasons, or we're unable to comprehend them, but the reasons are there, and then there's a moment when you take that leap of
I just
faith
don't
and
see
trust.
why it could come
Well,
at a great. Okay.
I have another thing that I'd like to add to that. Like two things. Number one is that through that assumption, you're assuming that you deserve like an explanation. And number two, I forgot number two. And number two is, I'm sorry, I lost it now. I was thinking about the previous thing.
It'll come back, believe me.
Yeah, it might come back.
It goes around.
Yeah.
My loop is longer than yours, it'll come back soon.
But the first thing is that like you're assuming that you deserve like a good explanation.
Yeah,
Like,
because
if you're
God.
already-
Yeah.
If you're already assuming that God exists, then you're assuming that also we have a fallen nature.
He's assuming that God owes me an explanation.
Yeah.
God is saying, I don't owe you anything.
Mhm.
I don't owe you an
Because
explanation.
if we're talking about the same God, then we're talking about the same God in the Bible, then we're also talking about the same historicity within the Bible, which is the fact that we're fallen and we don't necessarily deserve anything. Anything that God does is out of His grace, out of His goodness.
So any punishment that follows out of the commands of God are good because God. That doesn't seem right.
Well, I mean,
like-
you could think about even the Garden of Eden. Like, you could say that Adam didn't have any reason to not object to Eve's.
No, but I'm looking for a moral justification. Like there has to be like you can't just from the inference that God commands something,
Right.
therefore any sort of punishment is entailed as morally right doesn't follow.
But that's again, I don't see that as punishment. I just see it as a consequence of your actions. Like if God is all good and He's telling me to do this,
But you're
thing,
not-
lest something bad happen to you, and then you're going to reject that good authority, and then that bad thing happened to you. I wouldn't say that's punishment. I would just say that's a consequence of your denial of a good authority.
So if somebody gets an injury while playing soccer and like should they not seek medical help because that's just a consequence of playing soccer?
I don't see how that analogy fits. I'm sorry, that analogy
Okay.
does not fit.
Nelson Pike wrote an, oh, sorry, no, go ahead.
So, your argument that you lay down, or at least the points that you lay down, as far as I can understand, illustrate or at least circumscribe the secondary principles, not necessarily the primary principle. I mean, it includes a primary principle by virtue of the principle of non-contradiction,
Mm-hmm.
but you say at point 11 that what is good is then contingent.
Well, what I mean by contingent is just based on proper order. So in a sense, the goodness is objective by following that order. So when I just mean contingent, I just mean the value of good, the way that we should see it is based on the order, is dependent on proper order.
So, but then where does...
In another sense, value isn't like based on perspective, it's based on formulating the correct order. Like you have to observe the correct, and in another sense, I assume that like order is one essence. Like if you go back to enough sequences, you'll see that objectivity, which is the source, the principle of non-contradiction, coming from God, and then you can get to see the right order.
And the only means for fallible humans to be able to do that type of reason
Is to find the proper
is
order.
to use reasoning, find the proper order, but by virtue of revelation.
Well, I would say that, okay, again, assuming that my example is correct, that we just have created habits of vices, right? In a sense, God doesn't necessarily have to extend His hand in order for us to fix that line. Rather, God does that out of His grace. It's like, this is the checkpoint that I want to insert myself to help you, and you can choose to deny that or not. And then you can say, okay, sure, I could take that and it'll be easier, right? It's about efficiency. Or I could choose to say no, and then maybe have to start from the bottom up again. That's what I'm trying to say.
So then I guess I land somewhere to what George is asking again and again, which is I fail to see how there is a moral grounding then. Because I understand what you're saying in that you're finding the moral grounding in effect to God's divine plan, right? We only have access to that if we're fallible in our reasoning, in that we already have habitual sin that is then perpetrated within the secondary principles, and we need to use reason to be able to discern and find and go back.
Right.
But if we're fallible and we've already been creating these habituated sin reasons, how is there any hope of us being able to discern what is wrong with the secondary principles without referring to the primary principle of the divine plan? And without revelation, and how do we even interpret revelation?
Right.
How do we even get there?
Well, another doctrine of the Catholic Church is that God gives you sufficient grace. to be able to unwind, in a sense. And the sufficient grace is, I'll give you another one, the fact that we're having this conversation in the first place. So if you take that curiosity, you say, okay, maybe I don't understand completely, but maybe it's getting somewhere. I want to continue seeking that adventure, and then maybe you see that that's a sufficient reason.
So God breaks our leg just so that we can learn how to repair it?
It's not that God breaks your leg, it's that he allows it because that's what we decided, ultimately.
Okay, that's where I don't see, like, because you said,
No.
like, you said like certain things follow as a consequence. Yeah.
It's not that we decide to break our leg, it's that we decide to make our choices not knowing that that's consequently is going to break our leg.
Yeah, but God has the power to fix these things, right? Like, so God being all good and all powerful, right? Like, why couldn't he fix this? Like, right? Just because something is a consequence of our actions doesn't mean that it's good that, like.
Oh, I remember the second thing now. You're also assuming that if God gives you that reason, that you're going to adhere to that reason. That you're not going to adhere to your own thought process beforehand. So, like, let's say the dad in the scenario that I gave you a couple days ago. And the scenario is this: you're in your house. There's a criminal coming into the house. Your dad tells you stay in that room, and he doesn't tell you why, but he just says stay in that room, and then he goes and tries to deal with the criminal. You say, I don't have good reason to not stay in my room, so you leave the room, and then the criminal finds you, kills you, finds the rest of your family, kills the rest, right? There is sufficient reason, you just don't know it, and you should adhere to that good father's authority. Okay, so if he does give you sufficient reason, especially in that analogy, hey, there's a criminal out there, do not go out there. There's still the potential fact that the kid could be like, let me go help. Let me not follow his authority, in a sense. So, number one, you're assuming that you deserve that reason. And number two, you're assuming that you will follow that reason because it's given to you. That's not necessarily the case.
Okay, so the father, that example, like, the child does have, like, good reason to trust the father because the father they've had direct relationship and built a sort of trust directly. But with God, it is indirect. You can only appeal to the Bible, testimony of other people.
I would say it's direct
Because of the nature of our reason, right?
Well, I would say it's direct because, in a sense, like, okay, God has acted directly with his creation, but I would also say that God acts directly with his creation now within the Catholic Church. So
No.
Continue. I don't think there's a
Okay,
question
okay.
on that, so we have no.
So-
No, but, like, the thing is like,
I'm gonna say
the nature of the relationship is just different. It's like it's not, there's not a direct interaction with the father and the human race.
I'm relating that analogy to what happened in the Garden of Eden in another sense. So assume that God is directly speaking, like, in a verbal way. I don't think that's how it works. I don't want to denounce any other faith, but, like, I'm not like those Protestants that say, oh, I believe God is going to talk to me. He talks to me, therefore I act. I don't believe that. I believe there's a proper mode of establishing God's voice, discerning God's voice. And it takes a long process. And in fact, the Catholic Church is very skeptical in the way that they do it because they don't want to just allow everything as God's voice.
But if there's a proper mode of discerning God's consciousness, then God makes himself hidden in such a way that only gifted people could understand.
Why is that hidden? If he establishes the church on earth,
because you said there's a certain mode of understanding God. It's not any mode. It has to be a proper mode.
Yeah, because it's according to that proper order.
Right. But then that makes it extremely hard for people to discern that order. And and at the best chance, a gifted person can understand that order in a better way than anybody else.
Well, I would say since all people are innate rational creatures, we all seek that rationality. And if God really does give us a sufficient grace to
Look
understand.
what you just said.
Okay.
The innate rational structure in us.
Right.
That's put in there by God. Yes.
Right. The Imago Dei.
The Imago Dei, image of God. That's what Imago Dei literally means. You have to go.
Yes.
Thank you, Anna.
It's been a pleasure having you in the class. I hope you consider taking another class. You know how I grade, right? You know how it is. So please, and keep up the good work. Very good.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. The class is that our image says to us, there's a clash, right? You admit there is a clash, right? With the Canaanites, perhaps with other stuff going on in history. And we say, because remember, I don't have a problem with believe it or not, I don't have a problem with the Holocaust and blaming God for it. Some Jews have blamed God for it because it was a willful action of Hitler and the Nazi, right, and the Nazis to put the Jews in the gas in the gas chambers. Anything done by us, moral evil, we're responsible for it. All right, so I'm going to grant free will, that we have free will, and therefore we're responsible for that evil, not God. But when you have a command to exterminate a group of people, that comes from God, right? With no discrimination, no qualification. Then it kind of clashes with that imago in us that says something is wrong. But you're defending Aquinas. Aquinas is the guy who says, you brought it up, that if God commands you to steal, or to even, I suppose, commit murder, you're not really going, God, not only is a natural law, but it is moral. And something in us says, that can't be. I mean, Aquinas has just been natural law and totally disfigured it. But it doesn't make sense to do that, because then we will, the imago Dei in us is totally useless.
But that you're, I find difficulty understanding that, because I don't correlate the imago Dei with our fallen nature. When I mean the rational power, I mean the ability to find intelligibility within order. So if there is an objective proper order, then what I'm saying is the imago Dei is the ability to reason. And so if our ability to reason has fallen by the habit of life,
so we don't see the morality of go and steal from somebody, right?
Right, because
we don't see
that disorder that we
Okay, but another thing is, it's like that's another I think a big part of your argument hinges on the objective, intelligible order, and I think that could be put up to dispute as well.
Yeah.
Like, why should we accept that there's an objective, intelligible order?
Why accept that PNC is ultimately
No. Like,
no, wait a minute. The only people that can see the order and that can see the morality of the command of God to exterminate the Canaanites are people that have received God's grace. So a person who is not part of the church, right, who has not received the grace of the Catholic Church, is simply blind. He cannot see.
For some reason, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Can anybody see? Anybody who's people without Christ are we're all fallen creatures, right?
Yeah.
So it seems implicit in your response that I can perceive the goodness of God's action in commanding the extermination of the Canaanites, even though I don't see God's reasons. I have to trust it. But my imago Dei, me, has been so distorted that I see it as wrong. But if I were to receive God's grace, then I would simply go, oh, I see that God must have a reason. Even though I don't see the reason. There seems to be right? How do you go from the fallen imago Dei to an imago Dei that actually can say that is the moral thing to do? Because then that discontinuity between us and God will always persist until what? Until we get to heaven, I suppose.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, so what you're saying is, let me try to see if I can understand it.
Let's take our time.
You're saying that since our imago Dei has been distorted,
Right.
why should we necessarily follow the command?
No, so we don't see. I can get your point that we're fallen creatures. Even Aquinas says it. We're willful, right? We don't want to submit to God's authority. We don't want to see the goodness of God in His commands. But then when is it that we get to a point where we actually say, oh, okay, I get it. Seems to me only when we get to heaven. But on this side, we're always going to have doubts about that the command of God could be moral.
The same imago Dei that God gave us is the same one that makes us believe that command is wrong.
That's right, correct.
Yeah.
You said it, correct. Yeah. In fact, this is what happened to Mr. Mary Hugh Adams, right? When my student writes to him and says, what about the Canaanite? He says, no, I don't believe that came from God. But God is a loving God. God would not command genocide. He says it just like that.
But I make a distinction between the imago Dei as in the capacity to reason, to the reason that we've cultivated now, in a sense. Like the sequence of orders that we've cultivated in our head is different than the capacity to reason. What is the imago Dei is the capacity to reason like God, like to understand. So just because we don't have that reason now, it doesn't mean that we can't find that reason by fixing the order. I guess I'm repeating myself, but that's just what I believe.
But we will never be able to have God's capacity to reason.
But we're not saying that.
So we will never be able to see God's reasons at all.
Oh.
I don't know.
Because of the huge gap between us and God. God is an infinite being.
But
We're not. Even when we get to heaven, we're never going to bridge that gap.
But
That means we'll always go to heaven with doubts about the Canaanites.
But it doesn't mean that God can give us sufficient reason for those moments. Maybe not the whole capacity of reason, but at least just sufficient reasons for those moments. Like if God says, kill these people, you say, but why? And He says, because if not, then you'll fall to the same abominations they have.
Well, actually, you're right. There is a reason.
Isn't that a little bit of sufficient reason, even though we don't know the whole scope of the reason?
I don't know. Well, first of all,
If the conditions are correct.
I don't know that having people convince you that having sex in the temple is right merits is commensurate with the punishment to have all the people exterminated.
Yeah.
See, so even our sense of justice demands some type of fairness, right? I mean, we can reason that way. We can say, look, if I say to you, I'm going to send you to hellfire, right, without Christ. Is that? I grew up with that, right? The Catholic Church teaches that. Well, you go to purgatory, right, or something.
What?
Yeah, when you die, Protestants are very radical. They don't believe in purgatory. So guess what? It's either heaven or hell.
Right.
All right. So here's the question: How many sins can I commit in a finite life, 70, 80, 90 years?
Right.
Is that enough to merit eternal fire, damnation in hellfire for all eternity? So I say no. It offends my sense of justice.
Right. So the Catholic Church does have a distinction between different types of sins. There's mortal and there's venial. The ones that are mortal are the ones that could subject you to potential hellfire, not because that's the punishment that you deserve, rather that's the consequence of following those actions over and over and over.
Okay.
But still be hellfire for
Yeah.
eternity.
Right, but that's the okay. So it's not. There's a measure by which they establish whether you've committed that mortal sin. You have to be 100% consenting, and you have to know the consequence of that. If you say, I know the conditional consequence for that, but I still want to submit myself to it, then that's...
Okay, I agree. Look, I am willfully rebellious. I know the consequences.
Right.
But
Yeah,
it's
but
just
that-
our perspective of God. God is looking
Go
at
on.
a big picture. He's saying, good, this guy, no matter how bad he is, in 70, 80, 90 years, he could not have committed enough sins to merit burning
Eternity.
in hellfire for all
But-
eternity. There's an incommensurability there.
But it's not
Why
only
not say? Why not give him 70 years of fire and then he's out? He goes back. he goes
But
up
my understanding of it is not that necessarily God gives you that measure because of that action, and then that's your punishment.
Mhm.
It's you choose to no longer be in friendship with the proper order of things, and so you are justly separated from the people that want to follow the proper
So yeah,
order.
so like if you smoke a lot, the outcome of smoking is cancer. So then you choose cancer because you smoked a lot, right? Because you knew that smoking a lot would result in cancer. Like that's the idea. Like because you have to accept the consequences of your actions.
I guess so, yeah.
Right. I don't mind accepting the consequences of my action. I'm just.
I don't think-
worried
I'm- no,
about
no, I think we
all-
do
about
mind.
all eternity.
We do
Not
mind-
eternity, but about-
No, no, no.
But that's another
Love
thing.
the
It's like,
punishment.
it's like okay, here's something interesting. The church doesn't teach, the church teaches like, okay, by these measures we can say this person is in heaven. But they will never say by these measures this person is in hell. The church will never say that this person is 100% in eternal hellfire because we don't know by which manner God's grace will permeate into the person.
Well, that's
So-
why you got to just go with purgatory. Because
Well, no, no, no.
purgatory, you can
If-
get out of
if-
purgatory.
well,
You can
well-
get out of hellfire.
Well, no. If you're already in purgatory, you're already going to heaven by virtue of being in purgatory. But you only go to hell if you completely want to submit yourself to that disorder. In a sense, like, I never want to be in the proper order of being. I never want to be in God's friendship. I never want to be in that community of persons. I want to be separated from them completely. And hell is like, even though we want to give it like physical personifications of it, like, oh, this is burning, this is cold. In reality, what the church fundamentally teaches is the reason why it's suffering is because you're completely separated from that
Yeah,
eternal
right,
goodness.
yeah.
You're completely separated from that objective order, and that's the pain.
Yeah.
That's
Don't pull the
We-
seconds and got in trouble
yeah.
for saying there's no hellfire.
Yeah, so like
Yeah.
wherever God,
We had
wherever the
to
good
get in
is,
trouble for that.
wherever the
No,
good is,
fine.
God is, and wherever evil is, it's just a lack of
It's
God.
just a lack of God, which
Yeah.
is evidently hell.
Like so,
Yeah,
you're
contradiction
appealing to the
of principle.
privation
So, yeah.
theory of evil. Then,
Right. I get
Yeah.
it. I get it. But that's the Bible says hellfire.
yeah,
Well, yeah, but again, like we have to understand that when God influences people to write, as He the author, right? The inspiration is filtered through our mental, and so even though these things are necessarily poetic, right? It doesn't mean that the fundamentals of them are not true. Okay, so we have to reason and look for what's fundamentally true.
I get it. No, I get it. You've been very clear. Now this issue of the separation between the primary principles. You guys can interject and
Yeah.
in primary versus secondary principles. What is the can you bring up the Aquinas text for a second, if you don't mind? What does he say about primary principles? Are you inside Canvas or not?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I pressed F11 to make it full screen.
Are you okay? So go to Canvas. Okay. Because the question is, what makes the principles, the primary principles, true? Aquinas says they're self-evident. Yes.
Mhm.
You'll see it in a minute.
Yeah.
From my interpretation and understanding, the primary principles are evident by virtue of the principle of non-contradiction. And
No, it's different.
it's different? Okay.
I don't know how to find it, so I found it.
I'll do it. Oh, you found it? Okay.
I mean, yeah, I have it here. We can go to.
I'll find it in a minute.
Okay.
I think it was in Article 2 that he starts to talk
Yeah.
about.
Here.
Yeah, precepts.
The precepts of the natural law of practical reason, with the first principles of demonstrations,
Okay.
logic, are to the speculative reason,
Alright.
because
Yeah.
both are self-evident principles.
All right. Oh, you went too far. Okay. The precepts of natural law and the practical were the first principles of demonstration of speculative, because both are self-evident. Okay. So both are self-evident, right?
Yeah.
Yes, both principles, right? The precepts of natural law is self-evident. Now, what is self-evident? A thing is self-evident in two ways. First, in itself. Secondly, in relation to us. Any proposition is said to be self-evident in itself if its predicate is contained in the notion of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
That's analyticity, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It depends. This notion of self-evidence is analytic truth. And by the way, I'm going to make a statement, a bold statement. Are you ready? Are you ready, Oz?
I'm listening.
Aquinas has no idea what he's saying.
Yeah, I remember you said that.
Go ahead, tell me. What does it mean to say that the predicate is, right, contained in the subject? The word contained is so vague and so useless that I'm just shocked that he would even say that.
Well, doesn't
You know, the other problem is Kant repeats exactly that definition of analyticity in the critique of
Yeah.
criticism.
but doesn't
So
he?
what is containment? What does it mean to be contained?
It just well.
I think, because he kind of talks there, he says, no one who knows, to one who knows not the definition of the subject, it happens that such a proposition is not self-evident.
Right,
So
so here's the question. How do you get a definition? What is the definition based on?
Empirical observation and relation of concepts?
Precisely. So
But-
there is no analyticity, there is no a priori. Definition is based, you look it up in the dictionary. So how did the dictionary, how the guy who did the definition arrive at the definition?
But
By usage. What is usage based on? Empirical. There is no analyticity. Aquinas
But
is essentially,
he offers two ways of self-evidence.
okay,
The first, the analytical, and then the second would be in relation to us. So like, I would see that as the principle of non-contradiction. Things that we have to live by that hold the fabric of reality. It's known to us by virtue of the way that we act within things.
I don't know, also with all due respect, that
Okay.
that adds any more clarity to.
Well, then you have to assume that there are fabrics of reality that are necessary,
Yes, but that's a hell of a big assumption.
Yeah.
right? And then we have to break that down. But what I'm saying is that it's not just
Analyticity.
analyticity, but there's also a second part.
Because he says it there, now a certain order, in the second paragraph right below it, now a second order is to be found in those things that are apprehended universally.
For that which, before aught else, falls under apprehension is being, the notion of which is included in all things whatsoever a man apprehends.
Being means existence, by the way.
Yes,
Right.
yes. And so he uses the principle of non-contradiction, but it doesn't necessarily add or clarify anything. And that's kind of the thing where I was saying I get how the secondary principles derived via our relation of ideas and our empirical observations and how then we can associate things and then determine our laws.
Right.
But how it effectively just he creates the box, the capacity for principle non-contradiction primary principles,
Right.
and then fills the box with essentially God's divine plan and allows access to humans via revelation. If I'm understanding how Aquinas necessarily constructs this logic, because he's saying effectively the primary principles, those that God has purview to, but we are necessarily barred from in some capacity because of our fallen nature or because of our finite capacities. We have to rely on revelation or imago Deus to be able to get there, but if imago Deus is fallible because of our fallen nature, then we have to just continuously rely on revelation.
So essentially, what he's saying, if I can read, is that natural laws in us, and it's negated, completely useless.
Yeah.
We have to, it's essentially divine command wins. Natural law falls by the wayside.
Wait,
Yes.
Yeah, I understand?
Yes, yeah, effectively.
Okay,
Yeah.
but okay.
Ultimately, yeah,
Well,
divine command wins.
What I see when Thomas Aquinas says that the natural law is within all of us, I see the capacity to reason and I see the primary principles. I don't see how those are objectionable. Where it becomes malleable are the secondary principles, and so that's the part in which the conditions are need to be necessary.
But then what is the, okay, then that leads me to the next objection.
Okay.
How do you draw the line between the primary and the secondary principle? He admits the secondary can change, but not the first one.
Well, he says.
Where is the criterion that demarcates primary unchangeable from the, it will be analogous to the
Because-
analytic from the empirical?
Yeah.
Because the primary would be innate. In a sense, the principle of non-contradiction is innate to all beings. Whereas the secondary principles, they're not, the conclusions of which are not known to all because the conditions are not known to all. So I would say that's the distinction.
Right.
And the secondary principles become, for lack of a better word, bastardized as a result of our nature of sin in trying to interpret what the primary principles are.
Yeah.
Right. But wait a minute, but then if the primary principles, but look, the secondary principles are changeable, but the primary principles are not, but when he goes to define, now we're back to the first objection, when he goes back to define the primary principle, the only way he can defend the self-evidence of the primary principles is either the way you did it now, through appealing to our nature, that we never experience anything that violates the principle of non-contradiction, we still make it empirical.
Right.
Because just because we haven't experienced it doesn't mean it cannot, in reality, be essentially a fallible principle. And secondly, it goes right back to the concept of analyticity, that evade concept of containment. I have no idea what containment is. Kant has no idea what containment is. Hume tried to use it, and he has no idea what relations of ideas are. Because Hume, in the inquiry, revised the analyticity distinction, relations of ideas are a matter of fact. But when you ask Hume, what is a relation of idea? He doesn't explain it, because you know why? He doesn't know how to explain it, because it's an empty phrase. I'm sorry, I'm being very harsh on this one.
No, this is good. It's good. I'm trying to rewrite it.
Hume cannot defend relations of idea. He can say it.
Right.
He knows what it's supposed to be. He says it. Things that are self-evident or are derived from self-evident truths and will forever retain their certainty and evidence. These are direct quotes. These are not paraphrases of Hume. That means Hume essentially is buying into what Quine calls the first dogma of empiricism. That being an empiricist, he still wants to have analyticity. And the entire tradition from all the way through Frege, Russell, and Carnap is all relying on the analytics.
So is what Quine is trying to look for is reason that is like indemonstrable, that is not fallible whatsoever.
He's saying there is no indemonstrable truth that cannot be one day refuted by experience. Because then he looks at the definition. You know how he starts two dogmas? Analyticity is definition. That's the first thing he looks at. What is the definition? Quine says, I'm quoting him, Well, what do you do when you look at a definition? You look at the dictionary, the lexicographer.
Yeah.
How does the lexicographer arrive at definition? Because the association of a word, bachelor, with unmarried male.
Yeah.
That's the famous example of analyticity. All bachelors are unmarried male. But what connects bachelor to unmarried male? It's experience. There's no Velcro that says unmarried male is contained in the word bachelor. The connection is synthetic, empirical. Association of ideas.
But aren't some associations and ideas more grounded in reality than others?
No, for Quine. Show me where. Okay, forget Quine. Show me what grounded in reality. What is grounded in reality?
Like things that cannot be without these laws.
Give me an example.
I mean, I would have to appeal to the principle of non-contradiction.
There you go. You're right. Quine says correctly. You're arguing in the circle. That's what he says. All definitions of analyticity rely on synonymy, but synonymy presupposes analyticity. You're going around in circles.
But you can't
Now-
really step outside of your faculty of reasoning in order to like really check whether the principle of non-contradiction really holds in all possible worlds. Like that's a leap that we can't even make. So it's like,
Well, presumably, that definition is useless because you're saying, okay, what is the principle of contradiction? It is true of all possible worlds. Well, how do you know it's true of all possible worlds? Well, because it has to be. It's a principle of logic. Now you're going right back and
But
going
can't you
around
say-
in the circle.
Can't you say that it's necessary because you can't? There is no possible world in which PNC is not possible. Like you can't have the existence of another world without the
We
principle that allows existence to be.
our experience, I grant you this.
Okay.
I don't know what it would mean to conceive that the principle of non-contradiction is false. But conceivability has to do with the way our perceptual apparatus perceives this, whatever this is.
But
We cannot perceive contradictory experiences, not yet anyways.
but
Maybe some mutation one day will allow us to perceive contradictions, and right now we cannot do it. Yes, that right now we only perceive three-dimensional space because our perceptual apparatus doesn't allow us to perceive the multidimensionality of reality. But physics at the theoretical level operates with many more dimensions than we operate at this level. Essentially, we are like counting, this is counting with fingers. Theory, physical theory, is at a not totally counterintuitive, non-intuitive level. What Quine is saying that our perception of what is possible or not possible, conceivable or inconceivable, is no measure of what reality is. Now, does he say to reject the principle of non-contradiction? No, but he's saying the principle of non-contradiction is part of the theoretical edifice of physics. But one day, the laws of physics may challenge the principle of non-contradiction. We don't know how he would do it, but the physicists and mathematicians like Cantor have shown that you can conceive of totally counterintuitive mathematics. Right, for a long time we thought that if you add the set of all even numbers is less than the set of all natural numbers, right, twice. And yet, since you compare, since the set of even numbers is infinite and the set of natural numbers is infinite, they have the same number. Why? Intuitive looks like it should have double the size, but it's not, because you compare every even number with a natural number. 2 with 0, 4 with 1, and keep going. Both chains are infinite, therefore both chains are coextensive. Intuitively, doesn't make sense, but it's mathematics. It's
Yeah, but
self-theory,
it-
it's infinite success.
it
By the way,
seems- yeah.
natural numbers have successors. 1 is followed by 2.
no.
But guess what? When you go to transfinite mathematics, transfinite numbers have no successors. Because, right, if you add one infinite quantity to another infinite quantity, what do you get? An infinite quantity. So there's no successor. So what I'm trying to say, this is, we use intuition to judge reality. In his case, it's even worse place because he's talking about containment, and containment doesn't make any sense. And definition, less, because both can be shown to be depending on experience. But if you look at the way Hume says the principles of Euclid will forever retain their, this is a quote. Guess what? The principles of Euclid were challenged by relativity. Relativity does not accept that the physics of space, that the geometry of space is Euclidean. So what Hume thought, right, would forever retain their certainty and evidence, finds refutation in the general theory of relativity. what Quine says is that any principle that we today hold sacrosanct, central to the fabric, may one day be questioned by experience, and you cannot rule it out. And if you want to rule it out, you got to give me an argument. And right now, any argument that I've seen, including his, are totally bogus, totally empty.
So, okay, so it seems like what that's opening up is the possibility, at least. Right. So then, by what nature can you say that my possibility is wrong, but your possibility is right if we can't?
Oh, you have a theory. You have to have a theory. Obviously,
Okay.
Quine accepts the principle of non-contradiction as part of logical theory. I mean, he wrote books on logic, right? And
So-
he always, by the way, he always angry at people who said, "Oh, I found a refutation for logic." In fact, he says if somebody says you refute a logic, you're hallucinating. He says that in writing. So if somebody came up to you and said, "Look, I found a violation of the principle of," yeah, but Quine is open, and he says it in two dogmas, that one day the principle of the excluded middle, either P or not P, in fact, he thought that it was violated by quantum mechanics. It turns out he was wrong. He was wrong. The principle of quantum mechanics does not violate the principle, the law, P or not P, either P or not P. But that's because there's a professor, a physicist, philosopher, Reichenbach, was a teacher of Putnam, who wrote an interpretation of quantum mechanics that actually violates the principle of non-contradiction, but it's been shown Reichenbach's model of quantum mechanics is wrong. Quine obviously didn't know that.
Right.
So in other words, attempts to refute the principle of non-contradiction or laws of logic so far have failed. But that's not Quine's point. Quine's point is that there is no way to defend that these principles will forever retain their immutability. And that's what Quine is arguing for. There is no way. I mean, look at his attempt. Self-evidence. The concept of evidence is super weak.
But isn't that what René Descartes failed at? Like, he wanted to find perfect arguments when there's really no sorry. Let me
No.
see if I can formulate it correctly.
Correct.
He's trying to find things like knowledge without a doubt, but then I don't appeal to that. I don't think anything could be known without a doubt. I think everything needs to be known beyond a shadow of a doubt. Like, whatever's most reasonable, therefore should be adopted. That's what
I'm glad you brought up Descartes, because Descartes says in the Meditation 1 that God could have made it that 2 + 2 is not 4, or any such thing, such even the set principle. God could violate the principle of non-contradiction. Descartes says that in Meditation.
Yeah, it does.
I mean,
In other words, you know what I call in my lectures? Quine is Descartes without God.
I understand the fact that since God is all powerful, he could do the things that seem unreasonable to us because he's all powerful. But I also have to appeal to like absurdity, because like I think C.S. Lewis wrote something that says like God is not going to do something that is absurd. In a sense, like for example,
Yeah, he's not going to bring out things that are nonsensical.
Yeah,
like God can't.
Wait. That's wrong. C.S. Lewis is wrong. Let me refute him right now.
Okay.
Absurd to whom? To us. But when it's absurd to you, doesn't mean that it's really absurd to God.
No, but I mean absurd
Right.
in general, because then the someone that doesn't believe in God can say, okay, if God is all powerful, then why does he make himself not exist as well? But that's just absurd. Like, that's nonsensical. So then why even?
No, you're right. God cannot live a stone that is a stone.
Yeah.
But the point is, we're judging reality by our intuitions, right? Why are our intuitions the guide to reality?
But what I'm trying to say is, if all our intuitions are therefore fallible to change in some way, then why don't we just adopt the most reasonable ones and then just say, okay, if P and C by reasonability works, and then by that follows that maybe we could prove that God exists, then why don't we just adopt
No, Quine says that we use P and C because it works,
Right.
not because it is absolutely
Because
good.
it's reasonable to us now.
Well, it works. Essentially, it is part of, we need it for physics. Yes,
Right.
like he invokes numbers as abstract objects, they're real for him, they're objects. Because you need them for physics. Physics determines what your ontology is,
Okay.
right? Science, right? So if science one name is God, then God will become, and he says it, I'm quoting him verbatim, a completely kosher theoretical object of science.
Right.
Right? But right now, there's no model of physics that requires that you invoke God, right? And one day, it does require numbers. But one day, you can have a nominalistic interpretation of numbers that makes numbers what is called in mathematics syncatical arithmetic. That is, they're not referring. They're not referring terms like it. I mean, and. There's no object that corresponds to and.
Yeah.
Or. These are called syncategoremata. The word, the stable refers to, it's a proper name. Any proper name refers to an object in some sense. But particles, right, connectors are not. That's what they're called, syncategorematic. Okay, so, yes, the principle of contradiction for Quine is necessary for physics. But one day, some experience, right, some experiment that we do not intuit, but physics does weird things, right? Just like mathematics does weird things. We may find out, just like Einstein found out that geometry is places non-Euclidean, maybe we'll find out that some sort of mathematical property that is now a paradox in mathematics may one day turn out to be the property of reality. Could we ever be able to see it? No. We'll be able to understand it. I mean, conceive it. No. But guess what? Physics doesn't operate with conceivability. Physics operates with equations, right? That say, even though your intuition says that's not there, my equations say it is there.
Right.
Physics is flying by instruments. The pilot doesn't fly the instrument because he sees that he's flying straight. If he did that, he would crash. That happened to me. I flew with a couple. They invited me and my girlfriend at that time to fly to Key West. And he said, take the reins, so take the wheel, whatever. So I'm riding. I'm going to crash the airplane. I'm riding straight because I'm flying my sight, right?
Yeah.
And he says, let me take the thing back from you, because if we keep going the way you're going, we're going to crash. I was going like this, but to my senses, I was going straight. But he's looking at the instrument. He sees the little ball, and the ball dips.
Yeah.
See, the pilots look at instrument that show whether you're going like this or not.
Right.
Here's the point. Good Catholic quote. St. Ignatius of Loyola says in the spiritual exercises, if your eyes tell you this is white, but the church tells you it is black, you trust the church, because the church knows best. In other words, it is your church that is telling us, do not trust your intuitions. The Catholic Church sees the world the way God sees it. And whatever they say overrides your private little puny intuitions and my little puny intuitions. That's Catholic doctrine.
Right. But
That's flying by instruments.
I would have to reply to that and say that the Catholic Church does have to have reason in order to do that. And even though we can't reason within it ourselves, there are sufficient reason. In the sense of like, we would say, okay, I'm going to reject what the Catholic Church says because I don't know the reasons. But then, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, in order for the Catholic Church to do something like that, they have to have good reason.
No, they don't.
Yes, they do. I would have to.
No. Well, they'll say to you it's a mystery, and you don't understand it, and the church. Let me ask you, what explanation is there that the Virgin Mary was conceived without sin? Where in the Bible does it say that? Or that he ascended to heaven? Nowhere.
Well,
but the church defined it.
Well, I would say there are verses that support it. There are verses that support it. It's not like the Catholic Church just goes and provides things that are unreasonable without support.
No, the Catholic Church did use Immaculate Conception, because if the Virgin Mary was not conceived immaculately, then Jesus would have been born with original sin.
No, I could say that by that, like it's speculative, because then you could just say, okay, God, since he conservated Mary in the womb so that she didn't have original sin, why didn't she just do that with God? Which is what the Orthodox Church says, that God literally protected Jesus in the womb without having original sin through a miracle. So in another sense, one miracle and another miracle, they both don't have much support, but both of these churches just say that it is what it is.
Okay,
but
so who's riding that debate?
I would say that the Catholic debate has more support because because there's scripture that supports it and there's church history that supports it. The beginning of the church believed in the Immaculate Conception, and there's verses that support it. So
wait. What? The early church? I know, I'm sorry, we're a little far afield, but it's not really that far afield.
It's related.
It's related to this. Is that there's no verse in the New Testament that says Mary was conceived of a virgin or without sin.
Well, there's no explicit verse that says God is 3 in 1, right? But there are supporting verses that help you understand that God is a Trinity, in the sense that like there isn't an explicit verse within the Bible that says Mary was born immaculately,
But there is support.
That's the strength of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church says, invokes Matthew 28:16, that says, "You are Peter, and upon you will be my church. Whatever you define on earth, will be decided in heaven."
In other words,
That is, the church doesn't have to give a reason. And once the church decides it, it decides it.
Well, that's not necessarily true because they do come in council and they cultivate these reasons and support. So it's not like these things just, it's not like the Pope, for example, just goes,
No, but
"Oh, I
I'm
believe this."
saying,
Yeah, but these, even if they come in councils, they're not angels. They're
What do you mean they're not
fallible.
angels?
They're fallible human beings.
No,
Just-
they're actually infallible by virtue of the Holy Spirit protecting the church by Jesus' command.
But
So
they-
if Jesus really is God, and what he says happens, and he says this church will be protected and the gates of hell will not prevail
okay,
against the
so
church, then
ultimately
it's
they
valid.
lost. No, you're right. No, I think you understand Catholic doctrine. The ultimate Catholic doctrine is, you simply trust in the authority of the church. What's
Right,
wrong
like
with
you,
that?
have, you have to trust in the authority of God.
Right.
But I would say,
Just because
since-
you don't
since-
see, just because you don't see this is white,
But I would say in the same
and
way,
this is black, it is black.
but I would say in the same way that Jesus would appeal to the people that didn't believe in him, he would give them reasons and say, "Hey, look, I'm the Son of God," and
Okay.
I'll give you some reasons, but he won't give you the ultimate reason.
But if the church says that is black and
Right.
you see it white, what is the reason God is
Okay.
giving you?
My-
The
my-
church is giving you.
My issue with that relation is not it verbatim. It's just the fact that it makes it seem like the church is like this dictatorship that just says, "Oh, I'm going to say this is what it is, and you just have to believe it." I don't see that to be the case. The church has specific processes in explaining why this is this now. It does have specific
It
processes.
doesn't seem that Aquinas has a good reason why I should accept self-evidence or analyticity,
Well,
and yet the church accepts him as a doctor of the church. All right, listen, we've pushed. We've been good.
no, we push a lot. So
We've been good. Come here, you.
Thank you.
That was great. That was awesome. Okay? This is what we do. This is what we do. Right? Because I respect you, I challenged you.
Yeah, I do appreciate it. Yeah.
All right, good.
Very good.